Well,
So
why don't you take over, Timmy? Introduce us to our guest. Interesting professional career. I'm interested in hearing his opinions on things. But go ahead, Tim.
yeah, so this is we welcome Ken W. Good, who is an attorney and I don't know, do we call him bonds person now? I'm not sure. So he's written text on the bail bonds process called Goods on Bail. Has also argued before the Texas Supreme Court and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and so he's here to talk about bail and related issues. And welcome aboard, Ken.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So everybody's up to something. What are you up to these days? What's on your plate?
Oh, well, it's kind of crazy right now. I am, we're in the middle of a Texas legislative session, so we have some bills pending to strengthen, probably improve the criminal justice system. So we're in the middle
Doesn't
of
the
that.
Texas legislature, correct me if I'm wrong, Ken, but doesn't it meet every 2 years?
It does, and when it meets, it has the Texas Constitution says it can only meet so many days, and so
I think it's 180 days every 2 years, right?
you know what? I don't know. I've never had to know the number of days. I just know by the end of June, it's sine die. And so we're always, last couple of sessions, we're always there, at midnight or, running up to midnight to see, because our bills are always right on the cusp. And I think last
Right.
two years ago, I think the Democrats got up and left, right up 2 bills before ours were reached, and so they didn't have enough to vote on bills after that, and
Hmm.
and then I think that was 4 years ago. 2 years ago, they killed our bill, which we were in support of, right before the deadline. So it was
Well, before we get into that bill,
very
the joke I
disappointing.
used to teach political science was
Oh, really?
I think it's 180 days every 2 years, but in reality, maybe it should be 2 days every 180 years. That was always the joke. But tell us about the bill that you are in favor of and your experience as a bondsman and attorney. So we'll pause here.
Well, I'm not really a bondsman. I'm an attorney for bondsmen. I represent bondsmen across the state of Texas, and I specialize in bail law now. Have been for probably 20 or 30 years. But there's 4 bills pending before the Texas legislature. 2 are proposed constitutional amendments. There's House bills and there's Senate bills that are companion bills. So on the Senate side, there's SB 9 and SB 40, and then SJR 1 and SJR 5. And on the House side, there's House Bill 75, House Bill 76, and then there's House Joint Resolution 15 and House Joint Resolution 16. The 2 constitutional amendments, one of them is that if you are accused of a felony and you are here in the country illegally, then you're not eligible for bail. The second one is expansion of preventative detention for certain specific offenses. And then the 2 bills, one of them, they passed a bill 4 years ago called SB 6, which was a major bail reform bill. And so one of the 2 bills, SB 9, House Bill 75, is just tweaks to fix some of the things that they want to address this session from the original bill. And then Senate Bill 40 and House Bill 76 are just a very short, simple bill that if you are, the government cannot give money to charitable bail funds to be used to bail people out of jail. So no public money will be used to bail people out of jail.
Wow. So there's a lot there. So what ideally, would you say bail reform should look like or would look like? What would be the ideal?
I would say that most of the bail reform movement that we've seen across the United States is what I would call bad bail reform. I think what Texas has been doing for the last 4 years is what we would call good bail reform. And I would differentiate the two. I think soft on crime policies are bad bail reform. Anything where we're not talking about controlling crime, we're really talking about anything else. This myth that we have, that we have systemic racism in our criminal justice system that we need to address history of things in our criminal justice system. I think those are all bad bail reform issues. Good bail reform is where we're strengthening accountability, and we're telling people that if you do not do what you say you'll do, then you will be held accountable for it, and there's consequences. I think we know. It's just like our immigration system. It turns out we know how to address our borders, and we just have to have someone who's willing to enforce it. I think it's the same thing on the criminal justice system. We know how to fight crime, but we just need people in place that we support, and we have to give them the tools they need to fight crime.
Right. So let's take that the other way. Certainly, I've heard people who say, bail or a high bail disproportionately affects people who can't post bail, and that falls on certain demographic groups more than others, and thus we should eliminate that because of that disparity, not necessarily because the process is flawed, but the outcome, right? So what would you say to those folks in your line of towards good bail reform?
Well, I would say, first of all, we don't have an alternative to the private industry bail system that works anywhere near as good, and the alternatives create more problems than they are intended to address. So the measurements on what is good bail, what is a good release mechanism system and what's not, is we measure that primarily through failure to appear rates. So, in the criminal world, if you don't show up for court, it's very limited situations where they can go forward with your case without you, because there's all these constitutional requirements that apply. So if I don't show up, then that's a failure to appear. And different release mechanism systems have different failure to appear rates. The lowest failure to appear rate of any release mechanism system used is the private industry. Cash has.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Ken. Is that globally speaking? Is that the statistics you're drawing from?
It's nationwide.
Okay. No, because structurally, I'm curious. One of the things that has been argued, and if you've ever listened to the podcast, I tend to come at this from a more liberal, libertarian perspective, so I'm interested in hearing your opinion. There is an argument that the bail system the United States has is anathema to a, sort of criminal justice system, in that money is required. It puts an undue onus on people without means and such, and that disproportionately falls on minorities and such. And the example I'll use is when Timmy and I were freshmen in college, our resident hall sort of overseer, Father Carey, had said, look, if you get caught doing something wrong, you're going to do community service, because there's going to be rich kids that live in this hall and there's going to be poor kids living in this hall, but everyone can do community service. My question is, how do you feel about the bail system writ large, first and foremost, before we get into the private money-based system?
What do I feel about the bail system at large?
Yeah. Is it unfair to people without means, so to speak?
No, absolutely not.
Tell me why.
No, it's why is it not unfair? Well, first of all, we don't have an alternative. I mean, let me come at it from the opposite direction, and then I'll address your question directly. But these soft on crime policies, or the alternatives that are being tried, the very communities that they say that these policies are meant to help, those are the ones that are getting hurt the very worst as crime increases. So soft on crime policies increases crime, and the minority communities are the ones that get hit the worst. And then, just to address your question directly on why I don't believe the current private industry system does not hurt the poor, is we have systems in place right now to protect the poor, and that's what these simple release mechanisms are. I don't believe after all these bail reform measures we have anyone languishing in jail anymore. But once you have a criminal record, and a substantial criminal record, I don't think the court any longer has to set bail at an amount you can afford. They have to do that, because now they're taking into consideration your criminal history. What we're hearing in the news is, oh, well, this person is this minority group, and they set a bond that he couldn't afford. Well, what they didn't say is he had a 5-page criminal history, and so the court was justified in setting bail at that amount.
Fair,
what
because
we have is politics coming into play in all this.
Right. Recidivism is a big issue. I mean, anyone who watches Law and Order or any of these shows, the first question they ask is, do they have a record? But my question is, let's assume that this is an immigrant who, and there's this case that's being adjudicated right now as we speak at the Supreme Court where someone was illegally deported and they have asked to be returned, they were deported. Now, that's an extreme case. I'm not using that. But what if someone is has no criminal record and is given a bail that they can't afford? How would you reply to the critics of that?
Well, they have the ability to file a motion to reconsider or a motion to lower the bond at any time in Texas. So, they can file a motion at any time to say, hey, and also today you have courts monitoring, why, once they set bail, what is their status? Because we don't want them to stay in jail. So I think if I was, a county or a judge, I would first want everybody to go to post a private surety bond because of the failure to appear rate being so much lower. But then if they're still in jail after a few days, then I would be coming to them, why are you still in jail? I mean,
right.
What we don't want is this languishing. And if they're a first-time offender, obviously, I just disagree with the premise, and I think it's a false statement to say we have first-time offenders that are stuck in jail today and they're languishing there. I mean, there was a study that I did a podcast where I highlighted a study from a social scientist talking about the different reasons why people languish in jail, or that what affects the length of time people in jail. And it wasn't money, it wasn't ability to pay, it was criminal record, which was the number one impact on the length of time people stayed in jail before getting out pretrial.
Right. And criminologists estimate that 60 to 70% on the low end of crimes are committed by recidivism or repeat offenders, as it were. So that's a point well received and well taken. Timmy, did you have anything you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I was curious. So Texas has private bail bondsmen, right? How is that different than practices in other states, and what advantages or disadvantages might that confer?
Well, I think the majority of states still have a private industry bail system, which doesn't cost the taxpayers anything. It also has it produces the best. So it's like you need to have a really good reason to replace them. There was a former judge recently on a News Nation town hall, and the point she made was, because we're talking about we were in an inner city and everybody was saying we need to get rid of the private industry bail, and she's like, until you have an alternative that has the same level of accountability and the same level of looking over and making sure people go to court, and you don't have an alternative. And I think that's really the argument why the private industry bail system has been around for over 200 years. It does one thing, it does it really well, and there's nothing else that performs on that level. I mean, the alternatives, what people really don't understand is most of the alternatives, the failure to appear rate is so high that if you were just going to do that, you would have to double the number of courts that you have just to be able to handle the same number of cases you were handling before you implemented those changes. I mean, just simple release, like, we would call it in Texas, giving somebody a personal bond, or granting them no bond. I mean, releasing them on no bond in New York, or releasing them on zero bail in California. Those are all just simple release where you're going to show up with your promise that you're going to show up. Well, those have an 80% failure to appear rate at times. California, all their misdemeanor cases are simple release. And, I did a podcast with a DA, and he said they have an 80% failure to appear rate. And Harris County uses that for misdemeanors. And
Harris County is Houston, right? Just
yes.
so everybody understands.
Yeah, and if you go to Harris
fifth
County
largest city
Court
in the
Watch,
country, so yeah.
But if you go to harriscountycourtwatch.com, 2 years worth of data say their misdemeanors have an over 80% failure to appear rate. And you can imagine if your case is going to be put on hold 80% of the time, it just creates backlogs like you wouldn't believe. And what does backlogs leads to? Forced dismissal. Dismissal is decriminalization. That's a green light to commit more crime.
So let's just run our listeners through this. So in a private system like Texas, let's say someone doesn't appear. What happens next? There's a bench warrant, and what or what happens next?
Well, I mean, first of all, when someone's arrested, so when you're arrested and the judge sets bail, then when someone posts a bond for you, like the private industry, then we have a lot of requirements. You have to come in, you have to fill out your paperwork, and then you have to come in and you have to check in regularly with the bonding company. So there's a lot of supervision, and they're telling them, hey, you've got a court date coming up, And so you need to get ready to go to court. And so there's a lot of stuff being done before they get to court. And that's what makes the difference.
Okay.
But once there's a failure to appear, we're talking about systems that are regulated by different states. So we can talk about what happens in Texas. So they issue a warrant. And in Texas, the bonding company has an incentive to facilitate the defendant's return to court. And so the quicker they get returned to court, then the bonding company will get rewarded for facilitating that. If it's not the private industry, but it's one of these simple release mechanisms, then it's not. I mean, the warrant's just issued and it goes down to the warrants division and it joins all the other warrants waiting to be, served. And in that type of situation, it usually takes the defendant committing a new crime before they come back into the system.
Okay. So I'm not saying this is a good idea, but is would there, I've worked with who are on, say, monitoring for parole and things like that. Is there a technical solution to bail now where you could just, snap a transmitter on somebody and then just, where they are if they don't appear?
I think that's probably the push right now. And we're having lots of situations where people cut off their GPS monitor to go run or commit a crime. So I don't think the GPS monitors are an alternative. And also GPS monitoring costs more. If the court's making the defendant pay for it, it's going to cost more than being on a bond.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Yeah. You always wonder if there's a and of course that would increase the government monitoring your location beyond what it already does,
We always hear all the time how, it's not fair for people to pay for the private industry. They're paying for all these other things too, generally. They're paying for, they're having, like in Texas, you would have to reimburse the state for or the county for an appointed attorney. But even if you get a simple release, a personal bond, you're paying a fee to the county for that unless they waive it. Right. And so all of these things that we're looking to replace the private industry usually costs more, or the cumulative cost is even more than the private industry would cost.
Right. And so our listeners know when you show up in court, for example, right, you at some point you can have the bond returned, right? It's like a deposit. Is that?
Well, it's just a piece of paper. The private industry, you're posting a piece of paper which it's called a bond. It's signed by the defendant and it's signed by the surety, and it says that if the defendant does not show up, if they fail to appear, then the surety agrees to pay the face amount of the bond, whatever the judge sets it at, as the penalty for them not coming to court. Right. There are alternatives. There's like a cash bond, so you could post the full amount of the bond in cash with the court. So what's getting returned is the piece of paper, and we call it really just the bond is discharged upon completion of the criminal case.
Okay. Thinking, I'm from Wisconsin, and I'm not sure if you're aware, there's a famous case we had here where someone had at least 3 encounters with the court was bailed out, and then 2 days before November 21st, I think it was 2020, wound up driving his vehicle through a Christmas parade. And killing 6 individuals and hurting, I think, in the upper 60s of others. And so that, that drew our attention as a state. And we passed a constitutional amendment that says judges can consider public safety risk when considering bail. And, which made me ask, you mean they couldn't before? So I find that interesting. In Texas, how common is it, and how to consider public safety risk? Is that a nationwide thing, or is it a state by state thing?
It is state by state, but in Texas we have Article 17.15 of the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure, which sets out the factors you will consider. And the one that you've mentioned has always been a factor in Texas, but like the bail reform, and even before then in New York, they're not allowed to consider the dangerousness of the defendant in setting bail, which seems, I agree with you. It just seems like common sense.
So did I hear you correctly?
Sure. Yes, in New York, the judges are not allowed to consider the dangerousness of the defendant in setting bail, only the risk of them not returning to court. I mean, that's been a problem in New York for years, even before the bail reform.
Wow.
I mean, Texas, you can always consider that. Texas, the problem has been you couldn't, the statute didn't specifically authorize you to review criminal histories. And they added that 4 years ago that the court's required to review criminal history. But the problem before then was we just didn't have a statewide database available for judges to review. So in part of the reform, we set up a statewide system for the judges to view the criminal histories.
Huh. Ken, let me ask a question. We're talking to you, and I grew up, I've lived in the Midwest, New Jersey. Now I reside in Pennsylvania. I'm not familiar with the bond system here. And, hopefully I never find out about it, nothing personal. But that being said, is there a tangible difference between how Texas does things versus other states? Let's say Texas is on the one side of the spectrum. What's the other side? Is that California? Is that New York, as you're saying?
I would say New York, and I think, Pennsylvania, was it Philadelphia? I'm trying to remember. There was one city in, I think in your state where there was an article probably maybe a decade ago talking about, with these simple release mechanisms, they were granting personal bonds. And so the article was saying how many uncollected, forfeited bonds there were for the county, and it was over $1 billion. So,
and when you say personal bond, do they have to put up their own recognizance? Are they putting up their own paycheck, or how does that work with a personal bond? Just so I understand and our listeners can better understand it, because I'm fascinated by this.
In Texas, a personal bond is a bond without surety. So it's a piece of paper where they sign it saying, we promise to pay the county whatever the monetary amount is that the court set if we don't show up. It's a promise. It's a pinky swear promise. And if they don't show,
it's not worth the paper it's written on.
It's not worth the paper it's written on.
Yeah.
It's just a mere promise with nothing.
Okay.
There's no surety to it. So we would call a personal bond in Texas a bond without surety.
Okay. And how does that work in, for instance, my home state of Pennsylvania?
Well, y'all may call it something differently, but it's essentially the same thing. I mean, all these different things you could call, or all these things you call differently, they're essentially simple release. I think I saw an article this morning where your state was, someone had filed a bill to prevent people from using simple release for violent offense, for a certain list of violent offenses. And I think you're going to see more of that because these bad bail reforms is really pushing these simple releases. And I think the data is coming in so strong that the failure to appear rates are so high for those. And, there's no one being held accountable. And that creates all these backlogs. And it just is viewed, or I think they consider that the criminals consider it as a green light to commit more crime. And so I think to get in control of it, we have to change it.
Understood. And I really did appreciate your analogy where you said, look, what is the alternative? It's great that you're criticizing this. And I'll use a sports analogy, if you will, because I'm a diehard New York Giants fan. Daniel Jones was our quarterback for a number of years. I don't know if you're a sports fan. I assume you probably are a Cowboys fan. Is that a fair assumption?
I was growing up, but now I'm a Kansas City Chiefs fan because their quarterback went to high school.
Texas Tech. Yeah.
We went to Texas Tech where I went to law school, but he also went to high school in White House, which is 15 minutes away from Tyler.
Oh, no, that's
wow.
cool. And that's an addendum to this because, as Timmy knows, my son is a diehard Chiefs fan largely because of Patrick Mahomes. So this is a wonderful segue. But the reason I bring that up is everybody says to me all the time, for years they were saying, you're Giants, you have some talent. You just need a new quarterback. And it's like, oh, that little thing, no big deal, right? It's not that easy. What is the alternative, right? He's an NFL capable quarterback. He's not what I want. My question to you is, you're king of the world and you're able to draw up our bail system without any hindrances and any, difficulties. What do you suggest? What are some of the things that you would put forth? The 3, 4, 5 things that you think would really create a more fair, equitable, whatever term you want to use, bail system that also ensures that, heck, people show up to court when they're supposed to.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't use the word fair and equitable system. The purpose for bail is what assurance you're going to give the court that you're going to show up. I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with the presumption of innocence. It's just what assurance that you're going to give the court that you're going to show up to answer the charges. And so I think, honestly, this is going to sound trite. I fully believe it. I think the courts need to lean more into the to the private industry because no one else has their level of success. And so, there was a judge who did just their own little private study, and so all they did was do personal bonds for a period of time, and they found that for every 8 weeks of just doing personal bonds, they created a whole new week's worth of work for their court. So I think you have to rely upon the private industry more especially in the states that have done this bad bail reform. And then you have to overlay on top of that a system to protect the poor, first-time offenders, where if they can't afford anything else, and I just think that on a $100 bond, a $200 bond, I don't think anyone cannot afford a private surety bond in today's world. But let's say they can't. Then you have to overlay on top of that some type of simple release mechanism to protect the poor. But I think it would have to be for first-time offenders. And then over on all of that, you have to have a strong system of accountability. So even if the first-time offenders don't show up for court, then their bond's forfeited. They're not eligible for a second simple release because they weren't successful on it.
Right. One strike, two strikes, three strikes, you're out. I get you.
Yeah, but the problem, what we're seeing is like in Harris County, you don't get one strike, you don't get two strikes. You got like 15, 16, 17 strikes, and they're still giving you a personal bond, and they're not changing the bond amount. So, I mean, I think what the debate, we're hearing more on the debate now is, well, we should only look at willful failures to appear, not stupid failures to appear. And my response is both failures to appear do the same damage to the criminal justice system. I mean, there's not more damage from one or the other because the court has to put both cases on hold. The stupid failure to appear, the guy just gets just as scared as someone who's willfully running, and he's not going to just come back to court because he's afraid of what's going to happen to him. And so you've got to have a system where you've got a personal relationship with this person so you can explain to him, okay, you were stupid. Let's get you back to court and let's get your case back on track. This is what you can anticipate will happen. And that's what we're missing. And so without that accountability, it creates all these backlogs, and it just is forcing dismissals of a large number of cases to try to keep up. And I think that's what's really, I think we have people on one side of the debate that know that, and they're pushing these policies because they know that's what will happen in the long run. And so I think they're doing that on purpose to a certain extent.
I'm going to pass it to Timmy, but I do want to call out, I was just using the word fair and equitable. I think the way in which you explained it was excellent, which is everyone should have a bond and there should be some sort of effort to protect the poor. So I really hear here.
Yeah.
So yeah. Timmy, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I'm curious too, just for our listeners' sake, what standard is met for people to need bail? Because some of us have never run into this. Is it you have a judge has said there's probable cause to hold you over, or what's bringing these people into the situation whereby they need bail?
In Texas, so I would say in Texas the way it happens is a sheriff or a deputy goes to a judge. We would say even a magistrate, which would be, a magistrate is anyone from the chief of the Texas Supreme Court all the way down to mayor, American magistrate. But, we also have people who are called magistrate judges. And I mean, that's a whole nother discussion. But for someone to be arrested, someone has been to a judge with an affidavit under oath setting out why they think that a crime has been committed. And so the judge has reviewed that and said they believe that there's probable cause to believe that a crime is committed. And so they issue a warrant. And so the warrant's issued. And so like if we were going to issue a warrant for John would get he would get served with the warrant and taken into custody. He would be taken before a judge. They would tell him what the charges are, and they would set bail. And then we would wait to see if the charges that were in the probable cause affidavit, if they were going to eventually file the charges. If it's a felony, then it's going to usually have to go to the grand jury. So he would be admitted to bail pending, waiting to see if formal charges would be filed. And then, so he's being monitored, waiting to see if charges are filed. And on a misdemeanor, they have a 2-year statute of limitations to decide whether to file charges. On a felony, it could be either no statute of limitations, or it could be, a lot longer than 2 years. But usually on a felony, they submit it to a grand jury, usually within a few months, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, and the grand jury will decide whether to issue charges. And so you're out on bail while you're waiting for those to determine whether charges can be filed. We have some jurisdictions like Harris County, they usually do immediate filings, so especially on misdemeanors. So they'll decide at the time whether they're going to file a case. And so usually there you'll get arrested and you will have a case filed immediately.
And I think I've seen cases where people can't post bail, and then sometimes the time served while they're waiting that process can eventually be counted in their sentencing. Does that happen as well?
It can. I mean, they can plead to time served, and we've argued that sometimes a defendant or an attorney will tell his client, "Don't post bail, just stay in jail for a week, and we'll plead it out." But I don't think that happens as much anymore because I don't think jails want people in jail for a week,
Right.
if they don't have to.
Yeah, with jail crowding and all those issues, right? Like there's the jails have incentives, right, to facilitate bail, it seems like too, right?
Well, but the problem is, with these bad bail reforms, we don't have the low-level people in jail anymore, but the jails are absolutely every bit as full as they've ever been, but they're full of the really bad stuff, the bad crimes. And these are people that you don't want out on bond. And, the problem is, I would argue that those bad bail reform policies has turned the misdemeanors all into the training grounds for tomorrow's felonies. I mean, and we even have data to support that. There was a study from Yolo County, California, where the DA during COVID kept all of his data, and then he compared the release of a low-level offender on a private surety bond versus a low-level offender released on a simple release, and he found that there was a 200% greater chance of the person that was released on simple release that they would commit a new violent offense in the next 18 months, just based on the type of release.
Now, Ken, you've used this term, and I've heard it throughout, and it just piqued my interest. You keep talking about bad bail reforms. For two people that are not experts in this area, and by that I mean Tim and I. And by the way, why was I the one that was getting arrested? Why didn't you arrest him?
He's in probabilities, John. Probabilities.
Yeah,
I met him first.
There you go. But, what, for two novices to this, what, as you see it, are bad bail reforms so that I understand?
Let's use New York as an example. So the argument for bail reform in New York is that minorities were not being treated fairly, and so we needed to take away discretion from the trial courts, and we needed to have everybody treated the same. And so they enacted these policies. They enacted this bill that says if you're accused of, and they made a whole list of crimes. And so if the crime you're accused of is on this list, the trial court has no discretion to review your criminal history. You just have to be released on no bond. So you're simply released. The problem is, organized crime, gangs, career criminals figure out very quickly, if you're on that list, you can commit that crime once, twice, 5 times, 10 times, and you will be treated the same way every time because it is a charged-based release system. And so the judge's hands are tied if you're on that list. And so the bail reform rollbacks from New York, we've had 3 rounds now, have been to remove things from that list and allow judges to have discretion to post bond, require bail on those charges again. The problem is the list is still very long. Most misdemeanors, if not all misdemeanors, are still they have to be released. So bad bail reform, or I think the best example of bad bail reform is a charge-based release system where you just make a list of charges. The trial court has no discretion to look at their criminal history, no discretion to look at their dangerousness, and no matter how many times they do it, no matter what their criminal history is, if it's on that list, they get simply released.
Yeah, it's like the opposite of minimum sentencing.
Well, it's
laws,
the
right?
opposite of discretion. I mean, the whole purpose of our, the way I look at our criminal justice system and the history of it is we want the judge to apply the least amount of pressure on John to make him turn around and become a productive citizen. And, so for a first-time offender, that's minimal. But if you're a 5-time offender, then it's going to be more. The problem with these charge-based release systems, we're treating everybody the same. And the problem with it really is that the career criminals have figured out ways to make millions and millions of dollars off of it.
Right. And it's kind of inconsistent because the whole premise is that the context of the crime, i.e. demographics and other things, matter in how you were brought there. But then suddenly your personal context and history and things like that don't matter. So it seems like a contradiction in a way.
we see something like that in schools today where, we found out early on that if you drop out of school, then you have a greater chance of going to prison later in life. So some of our inner cities, the way they have decided to address that is to just not fail anybody, even if it requires dumbing down the whole class. And so we'll have situations in our inner cities where, there's nobody in the class that's on grade for reading or math. And I believe it's because of those policies which could be well intended, but they're actually increasing the risk that everybody in the class is going to have the potential for going to jail because they're artificially keeping people in school because they won't fail anybody.
Right.
And I think that's kind of the same concept when you get to this charge-based release systems.
Well, it's like substituting the measurable metric for the actual thing it's trying to represent, right?
I think that's a great way to say it.
High school graduation should be a marker for successful completion of some level of educational attainment. But instead they say, well, let's just goose the numbers for graduation instead of actually delivering it, right?
Yeah.
Well, we found something similar, and this will be kind of my final comment. We found something similar during COVID, did we not? Which is the evidence-based approach to COVID said children should be in schools. The incidence of potential infection rates amongst people under a certain age was nominal at best. What I always say, though, is it's difficult to avoid the politics of that because, God forbid, one person in fill-in-the-blank Oklahoma City or, somewhere in Wyoming, some young child gets COVID and dies, every parent in their mind is going to lose, or every parent in the world is going to lose their mind. So it was an irrational response based on the data.
Well, and I would say during COVID also, we looked at all of these terrible ideas on bail reform and we tried them. And so we saw all these different ideas on steroids about what would happen. And so
did we really? COVID did that?
Look, COVID did that because
COVID
we
did
emptied
that?
our jails. Yes.
Huh. Oh, right. Yeah.
So
You don't want to put them
social
in jail.
distancing. I wasn't even thinking of that. Yeah.
Yeah, we emptied our jails, and so we had. I mean, at the time, I was keeping records. I was posting stories on our blog about, you'd get somebody released from jail, and then they would be arrested again within 6 hours, and then you'd get arrested again within 5 hours. Then we had people getting arrested from the parking lot of the police station trying to steal a car to leave. And so, it just got incredible. Nobody felt like they were going to be held accountable.
Well, on a lighter note, real quick, let me just tell this story. I want to tell two things. Number one is I knew somebody personally. He was an acquaintance. He got arrested for a DWI. The police, arrested him and he posted bond, got a taxi to go pick up his car and got a second one.
Yeah.
Oh,
so the same day. But that being said, it is a remarkable. And Ken, we are capitalists here on Bald, Blind, and Buddy. So plug your podcast. Tell everybody where can they get more information.
Well, sure. If they want more information on my group or the Professional Bondsmen of Texas, they can go to their website, pbtx.com. We have a blog where we highlight important criminal justice stories, but we also have our own podcast, which is linked there, or you can go to it directly on thebellpost.com. All we talk about is criminal justice issues there, and we're intended for it to be a resource for legislators and the public on what works and what does not.
Absolutely. And if I'd be so kind, I'd like to invite you back on sometime in the future. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, absolutely. I very much. So hopefully, and we'll have more data to bring and talk about, like the stuff over the border. I think it's very similar, and I think there's a lot of similarities between that and crime. And I think over the next year, there's going to be such a disparity between our inner cities if they're not changing course, and the rest of the country as we go back to the practices that we know that will decrease crime. The pressure is going to build and build if we're not overcome with all the "we hate Trump" stuff in the meantime.
Right. Yeah. At the end of the day, it's our communities and our decisions and how we keep people safe, regardless. I always say, regardless of who's in the White House, right? America is about a lot more than that.
Well, historically, both parties have been pro-public safety. We went through a period in the 60s where we had this same cycle where we felt safe, we were more forgiving, and then we started having crime issues, and then we have a fight about how to address it. And the backlash from that brought us Reagan. I think we've been through that same cycle right now, and I would argue that the election we just had in November, part of the backlash was from crime, especially over the FBI statistics that were altered and changed a month before the election to show crime was up instead of down, which is what they've been saying for years. And so I think we're just now going through that cycle, and the question is going to be how bad is the backlash going to be? And I think it's going to be really bad over time because there's been a suppression of the real news. There's a lots of different things we could talk about on how they have been covering up the real issues on crime. And so I think that we're just starting the backlash. It's going to continue for a while, and it needs to, because we have a lot of stuff to do to get crime back on the right track.
Yeah. And this podcast, as long as we're doing it, John, is going to be and Ken is going to be a beacon for free speech and truth and getting these facts out there. So we really want to thank you for joining us, Ken. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Really appreciated it. Fascinating.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thanks very much.
All right. You take care of yourself.
Take care.